Hello, this week we are talking about Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron. A little bit of background about our author, Boccaccio. He belonged to a circle of writers and scholars in the court of Robert of Anjou. He wrote many works of courtly love, history, classical mythology, and geography. As a humanist, he sought to revive the literary heritage of the classical world. He's well known for writing the Tessida, which was the first vernacular version of a classical epic. And if you don't know what the word vernacular means, in the medieval period, it was if you were literate, it often also meant that you spoke Latin, and that's the language a lot of texts were written in, especially for the clergy. So it's important to note that Boccaccio is writing for a more general audience, and he wants like the average person to be able to read and understand what it is he's saying, because not everybody spoke Latin. So what he's doing that's kind of innovative here is actually writing in Italian, and that's one reason that he's kind of this important national poet in a way of Italy. He's obviously best known for writing the Decameron, which we're reading parts of this week. So some background on this text. A plague strikes Florence from 1348 to 50, and Boccaccio is living in Florence at that time. This plague kills 70% of the city's population. I'm fully aware of how ironic it is that we are all living in quarantine right now, and we are reading Boccaccio, but I also think that's in some ways very appropriate, because I think Boccaccio is sort of this is a text that I think we should be reading in quarantine, because I want to point out to you some things that seem extremely relevant, even though this is centuries old, right? So Boccaccio witnesses the dissolution of civilization as a result of the plague, which is kind of the theme he's getting at in the prologue. He sees total indulgence, total isolation, and moderation as kind of the three different responses to the plague. And again, I think if you turn on the news, you'll see that is kind of how people are choosing to respond to the coronavirus, right? It's one of those three things. And the plot here is that these 10 travelers kind of seek this middle path. They're not overindulging themselves, but they're also not trying to isolate themselves. They're kind of seeking this middle way. So some themes that come up here that I want to address are imagining an alternative social order in response to the havoc caused by the plague. So in a way, the framing of these stories, it's important to note that they're kind of coming from this place of desperation in a way, especially because so many of the stories are meant to be funny and kind of just like jolly, and the point is almost just to laugh at them, right? So some of the stories celebrate pleasure and indulgence as healthy. They also present sort of contradictory messages, which leaves it up to the reader to decide. And I think we can see that in a few of the stories that I wanted you to read for today. There's no single theme or moral authority gets emphasized. Another thing to keep in mind here, this might be a little tangential, but Boccaccio is also kind of writing in response to Dante. I don't know if you've ever read Dante. I'm sorry that we couldn't put him on the syllabus this semester. But Dante, he wrote, the Purgatorio, the Inferno, where he imagines kind of these very structured versions of hell, purgatory, and heaven. And he suggests that reading for pleasure can be morally dangerous. And Boccaccio is very much kind of pushing against that idea here. He's emphasizing that there's this restorative element that reading for pleasure can provide. And in a way, again, because this is written in the backdrop of a plague, I really want to push for us to understand Boccaccio as kind of understanding storytelling and literature as a kind of medicine. It's something that's good for the soul, that can offer sustenance in a time of great suffering. I think it's also important to note that the audience here is almost explicitly addressed as a female audience. If you read the prologue to the first day, the narrator addresses most gracious ladies, right? Speaking directly to a female audience. And also punctuates this theme that dollar occupieth the extreme of gladness, even so are miseries determined by imminent joyance. So we should be able to derive pleasure from pain. That's one way to kind of cope with all the suffering that we're seeing with this plague that is killing 70% of the population of Florence, right? But a question that comes up here for me is, if the book is meant for female readership, what is the message? Is it to entertain, or is it to teach something to women? Is it kind of meant as like a moral guidance for women? Is it meant to control women? So let's keep that in mind as we progress here. I strongly encourage you to read the opening, the first day description of kind of what happens on the first day, how these 10 travelers come together, because this is an amazing depiction of what the plague was like in Florence during this period. He says here, "A marvelous thing to hear is that which I have to tell, and one which, had it not been seen of many men's eyes and of mine own, I had scarce dared credit, much less set down in writing, though I had heard it from one worthy of belief. I say then that of such efficience was the nature of the pestilence in question, communicating itself from one to the other, that not only did it pass from man to man, but this, which is much more, it many times visibly did, to wit, a thing which had pertained to a man sick or dead of the aforesaid sickness, being touched by an animal foreign to the human species, not only infected this latter with the plague, but in a very brief space of time killed it." So he's kind of emphasizing here just how contagious this strain of the plague was. And again, he emphasizes three responses. He says one group of people lived removed from every other and shut themselves up in those houses. You know, that might be demonstrated here, where these people are posting these TikToks and these memes about kind of just feeling cooped up, and they're finding ways to entertain themselves. We're seeing that right now. A couple weeks ago, in the news was all these college kids at spring break in the beaches in Florida, despite warnings that several other states had issued about organizing in public places, right? So another response that Boccaccio witnesses firsthand is that people are carousing and making merry and going about singing and frolicking and satisfying the appetite in everything possible, and laugh and scoff at whatever befell was a very certain remedy for such an ill. So again, very interesting parallel here to what we're seeing with the coronavirus. And finally, he emphasizes a middle course for this third group, who use things in sufficiency according to their appetites. He also notices that social customs start to break down, families dissolve, respect for laws of God and man break down, male servants attend on women, which is, again, very uncommon. And he suggests that women are possibly less chaste in the period that followed. He notices people change the way they respond to death. Bereavement was the signal for laughter and witticisms and general jollification. Indifference and laughter kind of become the popular response to death. Bodies are taken out into the streets because there are just so many to deal with. The poor basically are decimated because they don't have ways of isolating themselves from one another. Bodies are buried in the nearest mass grave. Churchyards just kind of open up, dig giant holes, and try to throw as many bodies as they can inside. Livestock runs free. So it's kind of this general deterioration of culture. The plot here is that 7 women sitting up in a church decide that they want to kind of pursue that middle path. They want to go out into the countryside to kind of get away from the city, but they also want to stay together. And then they also want these 3 men to join them, who they meet: Panfilio, Philostrato, and Dioneo. And so that makes 10 people, and they all leave. And then when they're trying to figure out how to spend their time, Pampinea, one of the women, proposes that they each tell one story each day they spend together. So that's how we get to this Decameron, right? 10 stories are told one story is told by each one of these characters over a 10-day period, which gives us 100 stories. And again, the theme here is that storytelling is a kind of medicine. It's a way to pass the time in quarantine. It offers catharsis and healing, which is maybe what you guys are doing with our version of this today, right? Social media, Zoom meetings, Netflix, what have you. But it's also interesting the way that Boccaccio kind of frames, um, presents this very kind of problematic vision of women who, it's almost as if you can tell that a man is writing these female characters, because they say things like, remember that we are all women, and none of us is child enough not to know. Little reasonable women are among themselves how ill, without some man's guidance. They know how to order themselves. We are fickle, willful, suspicious, faint-hearted, and timorous, for which reasons I misdoubt me sore. And we take not some other guidance than our own company will be far too dissolved and with less honor to ourselves than we were seemly. So they basically are saying we need some men to join us to kind of guide us, right? But I also think it's interesting that a lot of the stories seem to kind of push against this idea of patriarchy. So let's take a look at some of these stories. The ninth story of the fourth day, the first story I wanted you to read for today, is about these two knights, Roscion and Cabestan. Cabestan is in love with Roscion's wife. They have this affair. Roscion finds out about it and ends up killing Cabestan, cuts out his heart, feeds it to his wife, right? And her response here is, when she finds out that she's actually eaten this heart unknowingly, which is kind of the opposite of what this picture suggests. She says, if I, unenforced of him, made him lord of my love, and therein offended against you, not he, but I should have borne the penalty thereof, right? She says, you shouldn't have punished him, you should have punished me. And then she takes a couple steps back and jumps out of the window, killing herself, disfiguring herself. And then afterwards, Roscion repents his wicked deed. Like, he regrets doing what he did to Cabestan, losing his wife. So the questions that come up for me here are, what is the story's message to women? Is this a cautionary tale about being unfaithful to your husband? Or is suicide an effective means of protesting patriarchal authority? Does she kind of gain the upper hand by committing suicide? And also, what function does cannibalism play? It's something we'll kind of return to later in this semester. The eighth story of the fifth day is about Nastagio Onesti, who is in love with Traversari's daughter. He is scorned by her. He goes out into the woods and he sees a woman being hunted and eventually killed by this man, who also explains to Nastagio that they're actually both dead, and he's being punished in this kind of Dantean. Again, this is a reference to Dante's Hell, where everybody is kind of punished for the crimes that they committed during their lives. So his punishment is to chase this woman, and then every Friday he cuts out her heart and feeds it to the dogs, as a kind of punishment for doting on a woman who didn't love him back, right? So Nastagio gets this idea. He says, oh, I know a woman who doesn't love me. Maybe she should see this. So he invites her to this banquet. They have breakfast out in the woods. And of course, every Friday this happens. This knight kills this woman. So Traversari's daughter sees this, and in order to avoid a similar fate, she converted her love into enmity and decides to love Nastagio after all. From that day forward, the ladies of Ravenna in general were so frightened by it that they became much more tractable to men's pleasures than they had ever been in the past. So what is this story's message to women? Is it a cautionary tale about the consequences of scorning men and their advances? Or does it show how men entrap women when it comes to marriage? So again, there might be two ways of reading this. This last story involves a bed trick. I might ask you to just take a look at my explanation here, where basically all these parties are coming together in the same room and then all sleeping with one another. Some of them deliberately, some of them unknowingly. And it's all supposed to be kind of very funny. But again, is the message here that the story is about promiscuous women, or is it about how easily patriarchal authority can be undermined? Because, again, the innkeeper here is trying to keep his daughter away from his daughter's lover, and he ends up failing in that. Last thing I want to say here is, if you get a chance, on Netflix, I'd encourage you to check out The Little Hours, which is based on the Decameron.